of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was expecting that the Undersecretary General starts by presenting condolences to the government and the people of Syria for the hundreds of innocent victims amongst the civilians in Jabla and in Tartus who perished. The Council denounced this and did present its condolences in the declaration made to the press a couple of days ago. I was surprised, as you were, to hear what he said about his visit to Turkey and what he saw there. Surprising things, as he said, in the Syrian refugee camps in Turkey. He saw children who didn't have food to eat. The question that I put to him and to you is this: what happened to billions presented in various conferences in Kuwait and elsewhere for the host countries, Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon? What happened about the propaganda in the Gulf countries and other countries who show the refugee camps to the host countries as though these were five-star hotels? Why is it that the USG did not become acquainted with it, that Abdul Hamid al-Sinia, a Saudi who recruits children and plays the role of a mufti within a terrorist organization called Arhaloshen in Aleppo? These are facts on which we need to dwell. As regards what he said on Jebla and Tartus, which were shelled when a terrorist committed a suicide attack. This is an incomplete description, to put it mildly. I'm saying this because he knows perfectly well that Daesh and Ahmad al-Sham did claim responsibility for these terrorist acts in Jabla and in Tartus. So the identity of the perpetrators is very well known to him. Mr. President, some Council members claim that they are concerned by the humanitarian situation, the protection of human rights in Syria. These states hold meetings and make statements, issue communiques, right, left, and center, as though they were a dove of peace and only worried about their prosperity and stability and peace for the Syrian people. This is the way they present themselves. But the reality is very different, because everyone who wants to know can just take a look at the behavior of these states and see that they play an essential role behind the suffering of the Syrian people and the tragedy that has befallen them and the way it's being traded, which was recalled on the statement on the protection of civilians in Syria, Iraq, and Libya. There's those who protect the terrorist entities and protect them within the Security Council. This became obvious when some refused to include Ahad Hashem and Jaish al-Islam as terrorist organization on the Security Council, despite the request made by the Russian Federation. These bodies work in an alliance with Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a terrorist organization, and commit every day terrorist acts. Jaish al-Islam targets civilians in their shelters in Damascus and Aleppo and other cities. They perpetrate terrorist suicide acts. Recently, they were carried out together with Daesh in Jabla and Tartus in Syria, as just mentioned. This, as I said, was resulted in hundreds of innocent lives lost. These same states refused yesterday the request from the Syrian government to put Jaish Mohammed to not call them a terrorist organization. And this becomes glaring where these same states invite them to participate in Geneva negotiations as though there was such a thing as moderate terrorism, as though there were allowed terrorism and not allowed terrorism. The same states enable the access of representatives of these entities into their countries and allow them to have access to the media, as was done with the head of Jabhat al-Nusra, who was received by the Qatari channel Al Jazeera on several occasions, as was the case with the representative of foreign relations of Ahmed al-Shena, who was in the U.S. On a British passport in January. And an article about that was in Washington Post on the 18th July and last year, and in the Telegraph. This is an attempt to burnish the image of this terrorism. All of this is an attempt to use them for political blackmail and to implement a certain agenda. This is what becomes obvious in the statements made by representatives of these states, because they threaten very clearly that they will continue to support terrorism in Syria unless the leadership is not changed. This was said by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia and Turkey, as well as other countries. The same states impose unilateral illegal economic sanctions on the Syrian people, which increases their suffering and represent a huge burden on the public and private sector, who are trying to provide foodstuffs, pharmaceuticals, and the basic needs for the Syrian people. This incites some strata of the population to leave Syria. They are forced to do this because of insecurity and lack of subsistence. But the Council ignores this dire humanitarian situation in Syria. Mr. President, how can we be talking about ending the suffering and the tragedy of the Syrian people inside and outside and put an end to the humanitarian crisis in Syria? How can we, now that the humanitarian and political situation is uncertain, what can we do to implement some of our goals? These sufferings are not a tool for political and other blackmail on the part of certain governments. This is something that was expressed in Erdogan's statement a couple of days ago when he threatened to change the refugee situation if Turkish nationals were not given an exemption, a visa exemption for European countries. How can the humanitarian situation be improved when Erdogan uses the Turkish territory as a transit area for tens of thousands of foreign terrorist fighters, including the United Nations corridors. Furthermore, the Turkish regime provides weapons to terrorists and uses humanitarian assistance convoys as a cover. The representative of the Secretary General, it would seem, doesn't know about this, despite the fact that I myself did tell him about this on several occasions. We, furthermore, drew the attention of members of the Security Council in detail through tens of official letters that we sent. The Erdogan regime imprisons customs and judges and reporters who describe the situation truly. Why is it that the United Nations Secretariat rewards the Erdogan regime by holding the First World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul when the regime allows the recruitment of children in camps? How can we put an end to the crisis without handling the violations carried out by Israel, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia of the relevant resolutions of Security Council on combating terrorism, in particular the resolution 2253, which talks about training for terrorism. This has clear ramifications on the security and stability for the region. Mr. President, I would like to talk about the way that the issue of humanitarian access is manipulated. The Secretary General's report deals with this inaccurately. What he describes is very far from the reality, is based on unknown sources, on unreliable ones. 2 days ago, we sent two letters, identical letters, to the President of the Security Council and the Secretary General on this. But I will simply limit myself to underscoring the following points. Claiming that the Syrian government prevents the arrival of humanitarian assistance to Daraya is totally false. In fact, the Syrian government has allowed the UN and the Red Cross to enter on the 17th May to provide humanitarian assistance as agreed by the representative of the ICRC informed the Foreign Ministry that they couldn't enter into Daraya for logistical, administrative, and security reasons, as he said. When it comes to the discussion that some are having as regards medicaments, the government of Syria does accept to forward medical assistance to all the regions except for the tools that can be used by terrorists. The government of Syria stands ready to cooperate with you to tackle any kind of issue as regards the convoys. As regards joint requests, there were 27 requests for humanitarian convoys into hot areas in May under the May plan. The Syrian government did accept 19 out of those 26 requests. So 19 were accepted by the UN until 24th of May, 2 days ago, only sent 3 convoys. 3 out of 26 requested by the UN. The government of Syria did accept 19, and the UN only sent 3 joint assistance convoys. If there are delays when it comes to authorizations and their implementation, well, this is a function of safety and security of humanitarian workers. And our concern, the humanitarian assistance reaches those for whom it's destined. Mr. President, the government of Syria has always been committed to reduce the humanitarian suffering of our people. We are ready to implement any national measures needed in order to implement this objective. We'll continue cooperating with the UN and to facilitate the task, but cooperation is not a one-way street. The UN also has to cooperate with the Syrian government, to coordinate with us, to consult the Syrian government when it comes to humanitarian assistance, instead of criticizing us and expressing doubt without any result. The UN and other international organizations over the 5 years of crisis sent humanitarian assistance to millions of people only thanks to the cooperation on the part of the government of Syria. Lastly, Mr. President, we frequently talk about the danger of terrorism and the importance of fighting terrorism. This should not be interpreted in a way that we do not understand the depth of the humanitarian crisis in some regions of Syria, or that we do not understand the importance of improving the humanitarian situation in Syria. We do. However, we think that in order to put an end to the humanitarian crisis and put it in the lasting way, we need to deal with the issue seriously, to tackle terrorism, which is supported from the outside, and the interference in our internal affairs, and not through financial contributions pledged in various conferences, even though we understand their importance. The Syrian government underscores the importance of political aspect. We participated in Geneva negotiations, seriously so, and we are committed to that. The problem here is that some states impose the Riyadh delegation as the only interlocutor. And the delegation came with preconditions and with a goal to making sure that the negotiations failed. And they withdrew on several occasions following the instructions. Thank you.
أشكر ممثل الجمهورية العربية السورية.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement. Are there any council members wishing to take the floor? I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you. I don't want to take much time here, but I'm just struck by the number of factual claims that have been made by the ambassador from Syria that impugn the reputation of the United Nations and the brave humanitarians who are trying to get food to people who are being starved to death in many cases. I think there's some irony in a government that pulls infant formula off of convoys, anesthetics, and surgical equipment, and doesn't even deign to respond to successive UN requests, accusing the UN of just not showing up with convoys when there are people starving. But I think the authority on this is certainly not me, but is OCHA. And so I would like to ask Undersecretary General O'Brien if he could to respond to some of the allegations made by the Syrian ambassador. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلات الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية على إحاطتي.
I thank the representative of the United States for her comments. I give the floor to Mr. O'Brien. Would you like to make any comments?
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. As I have said on many occasions before, the only authority I have to speak is to try to make sure that we gather from the best sources possible the facts, both with our own eyes on the ground and those whom we are able to trust to produce the facts, and to relay them to you in a completely fair and honest manner. And where we do that, because they're reports rather than seen facts, to make judgments about the quality of those reports. And so, having laid out with the best information we have available, I stand by all the facts that I have outlined in the statement I have just made to the Council, and I can certainly stand by the facts I made in my first paragraph, because that was my personal testimony, particularly sitting down at the bedside of Dr. Mazin, and as he struggled for life, for him to hear, to be able to barely whisper, all he could muster was, "Please, peace," I think sums up precisely why we need to raise ourselves above a level of dispute on the numbers, which simply don't pay sufficient respect to the deep needs of the people who are doing their very best to help some people who are continuing to struggle after 5 years of a fight which could be brought to an end if there was sufficient political will, not least from the government that was representing an alternative factual base. I stand by the facts that I presented, and I'm more than happy to write to the Council at a later stage, setting out further background detail if that's helpful.
أشكر السيد أوبراين على إحاطته وأعطي الكلمة إلى ممثل فنزويلا.
I thank Mr. Bryan. I give the floor to Venezuela. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I simply had a doubt with regard to procedure here in the Council, but because my understanding is that this was to be a briefing followed by discussions and consultations. So are we going to be discussing Mr. O'Brien's briefing in public session, or is it going to be in consultations? If so, then we should begin the discussion here, but otherwise I believe that we should be conducting that discussion in consultations. Thank you.
أشكر ممثل فنزويلا. إحاطة وحيدة أن رئيس الجلسة لا يستطيع.
Thank you. The President of the Council at the meeting cannot prevent anyone from taking the floor, but I propose that we do engage in consultations so that we can hear from Mr. O'Brien. If there are no other requests for the floor, I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
وأعتذر عن أخذ الكلمة.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I regret having to take the floor for a second time. I will not take up too much time. I was also presenting what are irrefutable facts, and if there are to be clarifications made with regard to the comments that I've been made, we are perfectly open to receiving those comments. We are one of the founding states members of the United Nations, and I am here representing that member state. We are proud of that status of being a founding state member of the United Nations, and we are proud of our involvement in the United Nations. But there is much at stake here, and I would like to respond to some of the comments made. The representative, the ambassador of the United States, said that she commented on what I had said in the context of the report of the Secretary General, but those comments are not accurate. We are not, in fact, leveling any accusations. We are simply informing the members of the Council of the problems relating to humanitarian assistance. And we have said on many occasions that Turkey is using United Nations humanitarian corridors to channel weapons. Mr. O'Brien and his colleagues have not responded to that statement. Just a few days ago, it was shown that the Erdogan regime was channeling weapons through these corridors, and involving judges and journalists and customs officials as well. If this were this information is in fact, I think the comments that were made by the U.S. ambassador are not true. The United States and Iraq are. This is another case. I mean, I could talk about Africa, and we all know what's happening in Africa. We know that the United Nations organization, further, is a reflection of its charter. We do not want a new charter. We do not want an informal charter. We defend the dignity and sovereignty of states. And The attacks, that the threats to the dignity and sovereignty of states are something that we will not accept. Thank you. The President, I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his comments. I now invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.
Raise money to go back to studio to be able to record my gospel songs, but they